So this is a short video to discuss something or talk about something that I think is probably too complicated for me to write in a few tweets. To provide some context, recently I was commenting on the review of a book, the Michaela Wrong book, the review that was written by Professor Phil Clark. And I happened to mention in a comment that the only real thing that I potentially disagreed with from the review was a comment about the need for a strong political opposition in Rwanda. And I didn't say that I thought there shouldn't be political opposition. What I said was that I thought the issue is a bit more complicated, and I genuinely believe it's a bit more complicated than that, and that it's difficult to simply say that a strong political opposition is needed as such. Now, I want to qualify this in a bit more detail because, as I say, I think it's very difficult to get across my thoughts on this in a few tweets. Even if I was to try and write a list of 7 or 8 tweets in a row, I think I still probably wouldn't be able to get to the detail of what I mean when I'm talking about this. And just to be clear, this is only my opinion on the matter. Others may well have completely different opinions, which is absolutely fine. This is just my opinion on the matter, going back to what I know of the history of Rwanda and right up to date with where we are in Rwanda today. So, if I take things back a stage and we think about the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and we think about all of the reasons that happened, and again, people write different things about this, but I think that this is very much an issue that cannot be debated as such. There are a number of key issues as to why the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi took place. Those issues do go back to colonial administrations, the colonial administrations creating division, creating allegiances, creating groups that they sided with and didn't side with. The rudimentary non-scientific medical basis for division of the population, the creation of ethnic identity, which superseded what was previously a caste system as opposed to an ethnicity, and then if we come up to date with the later years of the colonial administrations, whereby immediately before effectively abandoning Rwanda, the colonial administration created allegiance with groups that were known to harbour resentment against the Tutsi, groups that were known to harbour ill feeling and potential aggression towards the Tutsi. And the colonial administrations placed that group into positions of power, resulting in any Tutsi being stripped of any potential influence, power, ability to feed into policy making. And that was then what created the downward spiral that we saw over the next few decades prior to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. We saw first of all through Kayibanda, then later through Habyarimana, the ramping up of propaganda against the Tutsi. We saw, as well as of course later publications like Kangura and like the RTLM, we saw prior to that of course division in the classrooms, children being divided based upon their ethnic identity. We saw the exodus, the forced exodus and internal displacement of Tutsi population within the country. We saw smaller massacres being allowed to happen with complete impunity and no consequence for those that carried out those massacres. All of this context led up to, particularly the propaganda, led up to the large Hutu majority not trusting the Tutsi, believing the Tutsi were invaders, dehumanising the Tutsi, again over a period of some decades, to the point that we get to 1994. And if we think in 1994 and the beginnings of Habyarimana's reign in 1973, 21 years, a reign of 21 years, at that point we have a generation of children who were born in the early 70s, growing up to become young adults or even slightly older adults if they were children when Habyarimana's reign began, who know nothing other than being told and eventually believing that the Tutsi are the enemy, that the Tutsi are not human, that the Tutsi are Inyetsi, to be crushed. This is what was created amongst Rwanda's population as a result of those decades of, first of all, problems through colonial administration, then through Kayibanda, and subsequently through Habyarimana's reign. Those were the ingredients that fed into the hatred against the Tutsi by the Hutu at that time. And again, this is as far as I'm concerned from what I know, from what I have researched, and from those that I have spoken to over a number of years. So, we see ridiculous discussions like that a plane crash sparked a genocide. No plane crash results in a genocide. No ordinary civil war results in a genocide that the whole population, or the whole majority of the population, to some extent become involved in. That sort of genocide, the sort of genocide that happened in Rwanda, can only happen if there has been a significantly long period of time whereby the population have been brainwashed through propaganda to genuinely believe that the population they're targeting, in this case the Tutsi, are the enemy. Make no mistake, the genocide, whether it happened in 1994 or not, would have happened had Habyarimana lived. It would have happened at some point, whether it was in 1995, 1996. The evidence of the preparation for genocide exists. It is out there. All you have to do is open your eyes. Read the evidence that exists in the ICTR archives. Look to the documented evidence of the UN. There's evidence there that shows that the planning and preparation for genocide was taking place, and that this was a condition. The conditions had been created over a number of years. Now let's fast forward back to this question then of politics then. So we have the discussion over whether a strong political opposition is needed in Rwanda. Well, this is where I think it becomes complicated. So, I was asked this question maybe slightly over a year ago at a conference that I was presenting at, the issue of identity. And as of course everybody that will be watching this knows, the issue of ethnic identity, for example, is very difficult to discuss in Rwanda. There's a myth, somewhat of a myth, that you cannot talk about ethnicity or ethnic identity in Rwanda. And I quite often laugh when I see that assertion being made, because of course that's not true. It's not true that you cannot discuss ethnic identity or ethnicity in Rwanda. In actual fact, of course, within the sorts of circles of academic discussion or historical discussion on the genocide against the Tutsi, or even history in Rwanda in general, it's impossible to escape discussion of ethnicity or ethnic identity. There is no such restriction. What the restriction, of course, very much is on the glorification of particular ethnic groups and the creating or continuing a genocide ideology based upon the notion that one ethnic group is superior to the other. Those are the restrictions that exist. And again, I have argued this in the past, that for some bizarre reason, Rwanda is often targeted by, in particular, Western academics, who will say that, well, there should not be criminal sanctions based upon alignment with or glorification of an ethnic identity, that people shouldn't be criminalised because freedom of speech. I have pointed out in the past, both orally and in writing, indeed in peer-reviewed journal publication, I have pointed out that this is a ridiculous notion, that it's a double standard that is often imposed by westernised academics, westernised commentators, westernised journalists. Because there are multiple laws that exist that criminalise Holocaust denial in Europe. There are criminal laws that exist in a number of jurisdictions, including Germany, including Austria, and various others, that if somebody engages in Holocaust denial, they can be criminalised. So I always ask myself, and others, challenge others to answer the question, Why is it the case that when those laws exist related to Holocaust denial in Europe, why is it the case that when similar laws exist in Rwanda related to the genocide against the Tutsi, that those laws are somehow seen as being illegitimate? I have yet to be given what I consider to be a satisfactory response to that. And I have carried out comparative analysis of the specific wording and implementation of those laws. So, I think that I'm in a good position to talk about those issues. So, that brings us then up when I was asked this question about politics previously at a conference that I was speaking at just over a year or so ago, just before the COVID-19 pandemic took hold. And what I said was that if you look to the root causes of any conflict, whether it's a war, whether it's a genocide, whatever the conflict is, there are always root causes of that conflict. In the case of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, of course, there are multiple factors that go into the genocide, but the root cause of that was divisions based upon grounds of identity. Divisions based upon grounds of ethnic identity, to be specific. So people in Rwanda were artificially divided based upon ethnic grounds. They were divided, first of all, by the colonial administration, and those divisions were then later accentuated by Kayibanda and Habyarimana. Now, the problem is that when somebody or groups are divided based upon identity, then the way that we need to bring those groups back together must, if possible at least, try to fill the void in the identity that has been removed, if you like. So in the case of Rwanda, understandably, ethnic division or allegiance towards or identification, social identification based upon ethnicity is not allowed and is certainly not encouraged. The problem that you have there is that ultimately people will still hold within themselves psychologically different identities. Everybody is constructed of different identities. They consider their identity to be multiple different things, whether it's identity based upon family, whether it's identity based upon employment, the area they work within, whether it's identity based upon education or other social factors. People have multiple factors of identity. Now, the problem that we have historically in Rwanda is that ethnic identity became fundamentally linked with political identity. So politics and ethnic identity, if we go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s and early 90s, ethnic identity and political identity were intertwined. They were effectively part of the same problem. The ethnic issue being at the root of the problem, but then being ingrained within the political system. Now, the problem is, in Rwanda today, if we simply open the floodgates altogether and have plural politics in the same way that we have plural politics in other countries, other democratic countries, if we simply say that here's a strong political opposition, let's use that term, here's a strong political opposition. Well, the danger is that, again, people or populations begin to divide themselves along political grounds, and the danger is that the intertwined nature of ethnic identity in politics resurges. There's a resurgence in that division based upon ethnic identity and politics coming together. So the reason I say this, or one of the reasons that I say this, is that if you look to Western interventions in countries that Western politicians, that Western policymakers, the Western commentators historically believed were not democratic and wanted to effectively impose the westernized model of democracy, a number of those regions have descended into chaos. If you look to the likes of, well, maybe that's a bit, again, even that's an oversimplification, but there have been major problems, shall we say. If you look to the likes of Iraq, the likes of Afghanistan, there have been Western interventions in those countries, and there's then been an attempt to almost impose like a cookie cutter, where you get, this is what works in this country in terms of democracy, let's pick it up and place it there. There's a number of reasons that that doesn't necessarily work. And again, just to qualify this, I teach comparative law, comparative politics, and there's a number of reasons why that sort of action doesn't work more often than it does work. If you were to look to implementing any major political change in any country, you need to consider the social factors, the historical factors, the political factors, the economic factors, and all sorts of wider factors, religion and various other things. Because if the circumstances, if the context is not right in whatever country you're looking to impose a system in, then that system won't work. That system just won't work. And that becomes the point when we're talking about Rwanda. And again, just to clarify, this is my opinion. Not to say that a strong political opposition may not work in Rwanda, but that it's not a simple issue. It's not as simple as saying, okay, here's another major political party, another major political leader, let's just go with that. It's not quite as simple as that. Because if you do that, and if the unthinkable were to happen, and people in Rwanda begin aligning with one or other major political group, let's say, and that division happens along ethnic grounds, which is a very real possibility. If that were to happen, then the danger is that further ethnic conflict, not necessarily a full-blown genocide like the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994, but the danger is that ethnic conflict, in a general sense, could recur in Rwanda, which is something that nobody wants to happen. Certainly nobody in Rwanda, and hopefully nobody out with Rwanda wants any sort of recurrence of any ethnic conflict to happen again. But that is a very real danger if great care is not taken regarding any major change or major shift to the current political system in the country. Beyond that as well, not even thinking about the ethnic aspects of the problem of political division, simply thinking about the fact that, and again, some may argue otherwise, but the reality is that there have been huge economic gains made by Rwanda over the course of the last 25 or so years. There has been a real journey in terms of not just Kigali, of course, the focus initially being on Kigali, but now if you look further afield out with Kigali, you will also see in a number of areas gradual economic development. You see, for example, huge reductions in child mortality. We see the growth in the average life expectancy in Rwanda. We see the growth and improvement of the health systems across the country in Rwanda. And there's various other things as well. That's just a small snapshot. There have been, and again I will say, this isn't a matter of opinion, there have been undeniable economic gains, factually undeniable economic gains in Rwanda that have taken place. Now, a lot of those gains have only happened because there has been a focused goal, a focused journey that the country has been being taken on over the last, again, 25 or so years. That goal has been uninterrupted by major political squabbling. The notion, again it makes me laugh, the notion that the westernised idea of democracy is somehow a panacea or a perfect model of democracy is, to be quite blunt, ridiculous. If you were to look to my country, the United Kingdom, and look to the political system and democracy in this country, I will be very blunt, it is an absolute shambles. It is chaotic, it is not democratic, and indeed what you often see is tribalism. We see tribalism within politics. We see somebody aligning with a political group. We see someone aligning with another political group. And then they become tribal in their mentality and become ingrained with that group to the point that they see no wrong in whatever people from that group say. Even if it is something that is self-damaging, they still align with that political group. That's not democracy. That is still propaganda at work. There is mass propaganda that we see taking place in the democratic systems within the United Kingdom. And indeed, if you were to look to the United States of America, look at what has happened in that country in recent years. The tribalism that exists in the United States is incredible in a bad way, not in a good way. Those are countries, the United Kingdom, the United States, that have democratic systems with strong oppositions. And yet the political systems in both of those countries are not fit for purpose. So I would always say, who is the United Kingdom, who is the United States to dictate to anybody about what democracy should look like? The problem as well, the further problem that we have in these countries is that the question of, well, what is strong political opposition? In the United Kingdom, what you quite often have is opposition for the sake of opposition. And this goes back to the notion of tribalism that I just mentioned. Opposition for the sake of opposition. Not opposition because the opposition in the issue in question is the right thing to do. So you will have situations whereby one political party will propose greater rights for children and protections for children. And then the other strong opposition will oppose those rights being given. Not because it makes sense to oppose children being given rights and protection, but because they feel they have to oppose what the current government is doing. That's just one example. What that boils down to is, what we see is opposition for the sake of opposition. Opposition that actually does nothing more than stall progress. Not opposition that is effective because it's the right opposition to have, or because those in opposition oppose the right issue. As far as I'm concerned, in politics, the national interest should always come first before any political squabbling. But the reality is, in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America, that political squabbling comes before the national interest in the eyes of politicians. And that is something that we do not want to happen in Rwanda. What we don't want to happen is a strong opposition being implemented, let's say, not naturally occurring because the population want it to happen, but being implemented, and then that strong opposition putting up barriers to ongoing development, to ongoing issues beyond economic development, ongoing initiatives and development when it comes to the ongoing efforts for reconciliation that are happening in the country, the ongoing efforts to maintain peace, to improve security for all. Those are the sorts of things that can become dangerous political issues in the wrong hands, and where opposition for opposition's sake could slow down any progress that is happening in Rwanda in these areas. So, to sum up then what I'm saying here, again, I'll go back to what I said at the start. Am I saying that a strong political opposition in Rwanda shouldn't happen? No, I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. What I am saying is that, and I genuinely believe this, is that the issue is an incredibly complicated one. The issue of political opposition in Rwanda is an extremely complicated one, based upon first of all, the long far ago history that we have, going back to the 19th century, the 20th century, the more recent history that went through the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s in the lead up to the genocide against the Tutsi, the issues of ethnic division that happened there, and the fact that ethnic and political division was previously intertwined, the danger that a rushed job of creating that sort of political plurality could result in backward steps as opposed to forward steps. And so the fact that I think the issue is extremely complicated and is not as simple as saying we need a strong political opposition. Now, this, to be very clear, is not a criticism of Professor Phil Clarke, because the purpose, of course, of Phil Clarke's review was to review a text, and that, again, it would have been impossible to perhaps do justice to that issue of political opposition in the context of a short review piece. All I was saying is that I thought that the way that was expressed in that review was a little bit problematic in terms of potentially oversimplifying to the reader. And I know that Professor Phil Clarke, please correct me if I'm wrong, will not be thinking along that oversimplified opinion. He will not be. So it's not a criticism of Professor Phil Clarke, it's perhaps a criticism of the slightly, I think, unfortunate way that was expressed in the review. So that sums up my answer to the question that I was asked regarding perhaps expanding on when I said that I thought that the issue of strong political opposition was an oversimplification, that I think that there's again more that I could say, but I have expanded somewhat, I think, to hopefully give more context as to what my thinking on that issue is and why it is that I think that way on the issue. So I'll leave it for now, but please do feel free to ask any more questions about anything that I've said here that you still might want to ask.